How far would you go with anger and resentment? When you're in a painful relationship, it's common for these emotions to come to the surface and make you do crazy things for love. But is it love, jealousy, or revenge? These are the three hypotheses in the case of Doreen Erbert, who was murdered by a wolf on Halloween night in 1984. Halloween is typically a night of family laughter and joy. Costumes, candy, and mischief are usually just a few of the things that characterize this special time. However, sometimes what begins as a night of candy and costumes could end as a night of absolute terror. On October 31, 1984, in San Jose, California, 31-year-old Doreen Erbert, who was 8 months pregnant, was enjoying Halloween night with her 4-year-old daughter, Deanna, and her husband, Charles. But when Charles stepped out of the house for a few minutes, terror came knocking. A knock that from the first moment made Doreen expect the worst. The kind of knock filled with anger and violence didn't bode well. So cautiously, Doreen ordered her little girl to hide behind the sofa and not come out until she was told. What she found on the other side was a terrifying sight. A sight that turned her last moments of life into a horrific experience. When Charles returned, he found a gruesome scene. His wife's mutilated body, breathing weakly in a pool of blood. The body of their unborn child lying lifeless a few steps away, and on the floor, a strange mask of a madman. What seemed to be a peaceful Halloween night had turned into a macabre and brutal crime. A crime whose perpetrator was closer than anyone could have imagined. Doreen Erbert was a warm and wonderful human being, a sweet and gentle person who seemed almost blessed with a gift for caring, helping, and taking care of others. Born Doreen Ray Hitchens in 1984, she was the fourth of 5 children in a solid, close-knit, and loving family. These qualities were reflected throughout her life. Charles Erbert, her husband, described her as an angel, a description unanimously shared by all who knew her, and reflected in the career to which she chose to devote her life: medicine and physical therapy, activities that those closest to her said she loved deeply. A beloved and cherished person who had at least one enemy. While working as a physical therapist, Doreen met Michael Dennis, a man who was the exact opposite of her. Dennis, who worked as a sprayer in a factory next door to where Doreen worked, had a character, social life, and habits that were completely different from Doreen's. While she was an extremely happy, upbeat, and outgoing woman, Dennis was on the verge of depression. He had an alienating and empty job, was not used to socializing, and the few friends he had described him as an extremely confrontational and unhappy person. But the differences didn't stop there. In contrast to Doreen's healthy and happy childhood, Michael Dennis had suffered significant hearing loss as a child. He had a slight stutter and used a hearing aid. Despite all this, in a very surprising, or perhaps not so surprising way, this pair of opposites was drawn together almost magnetically. Doreen found in Michael someone to care for, and Michael found in her someone to give him all the affection and warmth that had been so elusive in the past. The relationship escalated quickly, and within a few months, they had decided to get married. On April 17, 1976, Doreen gave birth to her first and only son, Paul, a little boy who in a way was the only good thing to come out of this marriage. In a very short time, this chemistry between opposites became unsustainable, and although Michael was thrilled with his new role as a family man, his marital relationship with Doreen was quite the opposite. Dennis was being treated for depression, and his difficult temperament led Doreen to file for divorce in less than a year. The separation was final, and custody of little Paul was given to his mother Monday through Friday, while Michael had him on the weekends. The vast differences between Doreen and her ex-husband became more apparent as time went on. While Michael gradually succumbed to bitterness and unhappiness, Doreen managed to move forward. A year later, in 1978, while still working as a physical therapist, Doreen met the man who would become her new husband, Charles Erbert. If Doreen and her ex-husband were polar opposites, Charles and Doreen were kindred spirits. Charles was a focused, mature, and successful man with a thriving business and home of his own. The chemistry between them was instant, and before they knew it, they had become a couple. They married that same year. She left her job as a physical therapist to work as a secretary in her new husband's business, and in 1979, little Deanna was born to Doreen and Charles. At this point, the situation was still sustainable. Doreen had moved on, had a beautiful and happy family, and although her ex-husband Michael was still far from being an emotionally stable person, he was a good father who cared for his son's well-being and visited him tirelessly every week. However, this fragile climate of stability and happiness was about to fracture. In February 1980, 3-year-old Paul was playing in the backyard when he managed to get past the fence around the house's swimming pool. At first, Doreen was calm because she could see him through the kitchen window. However, the moment she was distracted for a few moments coincided with the moment her child from a previous marriage crossed that precarious fence. Doreen ran out when she lost sight of him, only to find him floating in a pool. Paul was put on life support, but after a week of fighting for his life, little Paul died, and with him, the peace that surrounded this family. The tragic death of little Paul was painful for everyone, but most of all, for his father. Unlike Doreen, who had many friends, loved ones, a wonderful husband, and a young daughter, Michael had nothing. His son Paul had been the only ray of light in his unstable, lonely, and depressing life, and now he was gone. The child's death had been tragic, of course, but from that day on, something inside him broke, and all the shadows of his psyche, shadows he had barely managed to keep at bay in recent years, began to grow stronger and stronger. In his eyes, it was all Doreen's fault. He had never hidden his concern about the pool. Doreen's dog had also drowned there a few months earlier. Putting the fence around the pool had been his suggestion. Michael tried to take things to court by filing a negligence lawsuit, and the case went to trial in March 1982. However, the court ruled in favor of Doreen, stating that it had all been an accident. Still, Michael never acknowledged it. Angry and consumed with bitterness, he began to withdraw into himself more and more. It simply made no sense to him that it had been an accident, and the more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that his son's death had not been an accident, but a premeditated act, a ploy by Doreen and her husband to get rid of him and break the only bond he had with them. Michael, however, was unable to understand that he was not the only one suffering. The Erberts were also devastated by the tragedy. Doreen had lost her oldest son, and her husband, Charles, loved and cared for the child as if he were his own. Shortly after the tragedy, Doreen and Charles tried to have another baby, but things didn't get any easier, as Doreen ended up having 2 miscarriages. Still, the couple was determined to move forward. In 1984, 2 years after the disaster, Doreen became pregnant for the 4th time, and in time, they discovered it was a boy. The news filled everyone with joy, except for Michael. Doreen's ex-husband had tried to move on and rebuild his life, but he was too busy wallowing in self-pity and bitterness. When he learned that the Erberts were going to have a new baby, he couldn't stand it. How could they be happy and have this child after he had lost his? What right did they have to take away what he loved most and go on with their lives as if nothing had happened? Michael Dennis wasn't going to let them. And finally, all the demons in his mind, all the dark and sinister thoughts that had been twisting in his mind for years and years, culminated in something horrible and terrible. On October 31st, 1984, the Erberts expected to enjoy a very ordinary and simple holiday. That night, Doreen, who was only a month away from giving birth, took her little 4-year-old Deanna out for trick-or-treating. People were wearing monster and ghost masks everywhere, but the atmosphere was mostly happy. After a while, Deanna and Doreen returned home. Charles was handing out candy to the children and came back to the house. After a while, however, Charles decided to go out to buy more candy and took the opportunity to stop by the liquor store. Charles was out for no more than 15 minutes, but if he had known what would happen during those minutes, he never would have left. According to little Deanna, the knocking was too loud and aggressive to be her father. Doreen went to see who it was. The figure she encountered was shocking, to say the least. An adult man, armed with an 18-inch machete and his face covered by a wolf mask, stood menacingly before her. The only words the man spoke were, "I'm going to kill you." Terrified, Doreen told her daughter to run and then shouted at the man to leave. When Doreen's husband returned home, he found the door open and his wife lying on the floor, her body covered in deep wounds and drenched in blood, and their unborn child dead next to her. The baby had been ripped from his mother's womb and cut into pieces. Charles was in shock. There was so much blood on the floor that he slipped when he stepped on it. Distraught, he called the fire department and asked some neighbors for help, but Doreen died long before they got to the hospital. The only good thing was that Deanna was found unharmed in the home and fortunately didn't witness anything. When rescuers arrived at the scene, Charles was so out of it that he was considered the prime suspect. His behavior was erratic, his breath reeked of alcohol, and he was covered in blood, so it wasn't unreasonable to think that he had gone crazy and attacked his wife. Jamie Saldivar, a retired San Jose police officer, described him as follows. "As I looked out the window of the patrol car, I could see that he was extremely agitated, extremely hyperactive, screaming and yelling something about, 'My wife, my wife, my wife.' At one point, he started trying to kick the windows and was banging his head against the window. Soon after, however, it became clear that someone else had done this. A trail of blood led out of the house, suggesting that the perpetrator had fled the scene, and a wolf mask was found on the door of the house. The investigation soon revealed that Doreen had a former partner who had repeatedly shown signs of being emotionally unstable, and the breakup had been delicate. So they went to investigate Michael. Officers arrived at the house around 12:20 a.m. on November 1st, and the situation was very strange from the start. Michael took quite a while to come out of the house, although it was obvious that someone was inside, as the lights were on and the shower could be heard. When the man finally came out, he was quite friendly and calm. However, the agents soon noticed that he had a bandage on his wrist, supposedly from a cut he had received while cutting a pumpkin. The agents began to search the house, and for a moment, as they approached his room, Michael was about to grab a gun and shoot at the officers. However, he was peacefully detained. Evidence soon surfaced: bloodstains outside the house, around the house, on some of his clothing, in his car. Subsequent searches turned up a hardware store receipt for an 18-inch machete, even 2 homemade coffins, and several body bags. Initially, Michael Dennis was released 48 hours after his arrest for lack of conclusive evidence. But he was rearrested on November 5, 1984, after blood samples found at the scene matched his blood type. He was charged with the murder of Doreen Erbert and her unborn child, and was found guilty in 1988. For several years, his attorneys tried to appeal the conviction, claiming that it was all involuntary manslaughter due to Michael's mental problems. However, the court denied the appeals and sentenced him to die in the gas chamber in 1999. However, since the death penalty was repealed in the state of California shortly thereafter, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. At the time of this video, he is 73 years old, and surprisingly, still trying to appeal his case in the vain hope that his sentence will be overturned. Thus ends the story of a man who succumbed to his inner demons, the dark voices of his mind, and allowed himself to be buried by bitterness and resentment. All the while, Doreen's loved ones had chosen to follow the noble virtues of his mother and wife. I can understand that he lost a child. I understand that. But you also took something from me. You took something big. You took my mom. You destroyed our family, and I won't forget that. But I forgive him for my own sanity. Doreen's daughter said, "I don't want to be angry anymore." The example of a kind-hearted woman who always preferred to move forward, leave the past behind, and forgive. Something Michael never had the strength to try. Something that can undoubtedly be one of the greatest challenges, but also one of the most necessary. There's no doubt that many demons come out on Halloween to take over the minds of the weakest and most traumatized. Was it influenced by a night like Halloween, or was it just an impulse driven by anger and resentment? If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications so you never miss a video. See you next time.